And welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History and the End of History podcast, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made these times. Today, we're continuing our series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. Now, we're nearing the end of the Civil War part of the story. In fact, today, the battles will wrap up in today's episode. If you've not been to the site yet, theendofhistory.net, I encourage you to check it out. Lots of articles, infographics, other series that we've made through the years to help you better understand the world. You can head over to theendofhistory.net or simply type in jbshreve.com. We're going to go ahead and jump in. Let's jump into today's episode, The Civil War Ends, Sort of.
This is the end of history.
Of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So, in an earlier episode, we saw how July 4th, 1863, two big events occurred hundreds of miles apart that literally changed the course of American history. In Pennsylvania, General George G. Meade, he turned back General Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg after those 3 days of horrific fighting. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's greatest military instrument, had failed in its invasion of the North and was retreating now toward Virginia. At the same time, on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, General Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of Vicksburg, Mississippi. So with that victory, the Union gained control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in two. So the Confederacy was not yet defeated. Nearly 2 years of brutal warfare still remained. It was still ahead of us in this story. Hundreds of thousands of more men would die. Cities would burn. Farms would be ruined. Families would be shattered. But after Gettysburg, after Vicksburg, the question was not really, it was no longer whether the Confederacy could win the war. The question was, how long could they continue fighting? Now, no man symbolized the changing fortunes of the Union, the Yankees, the Northern Army, the Northern military, the North in general, than Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike many generals, Grant possessed a quality desperately lacking in Union leadership. He fought to win. Earlier Union commanders, they often hesitated, right? McClellan hesitated. Others hesitated. They worried about casualties. They exaggerated enemy strength. They sought perfect conditions before moving into battle. They didn't want to be the scapegoat. Grant didn't care, or at least he didn't behave that way. He understood something fundamental about the conflict. The Union possessed greater manpower, possessed greater industry, possessed greater transportation and resources. And if the North relentlessly applied those advantages, the Confederacy simply could not survive. At Fort Donelson in 1862, when Confederate officers asked for terms of surrender, Grant famously demanded unconditional surrender. At Shiloh, he absorbed a devastating Confederate attack and then counterattacked. At Vicksburg, he executed one of the most brilliant campaigns in American military history, marching his army through hostile territory, winning a series of battles, isolating the city, and forcing its surrender. Most importantly, in all of this, Grant remained calm. When others panicked, he became quieter. When others saw disaster, he searched for opportunity. And Abraham Lincoln, the president, he noticed all this. The president, he had endured a parade of disappointing generals. George McClellan wouldn't fight. Others fought and lost. Some fought cautiously when boldness was required. But again, Grant was different. When critics complained about Grant's drinking, Lincoln reportedly replied, "I wish some of you would tell me the brand of whiskey that Grant drinks. I would like to send a barrel of it to my other generals." So whether Lincoln actually said those exact words, that's debated. But the story captures an undeniable truth. Lincoln trusted Grant because Grant delivered results. By March 1864, Lincoln promoted Ulysses S. Grant to lieutenant general, the rank once held by George Washington. No American officer has held it since. So now Grant commanded all Union armies, and the war entered a new phase. Now, Grant immediately changed the way the Union fought. Previous campaigns often operated independently. Armies moved separately. They pursued separate objectives. Grant envisioned something larger. He intended to unleash all Union armies simultaneously. The Confederacy had survived by shifting troops from one crisis to another. Grant aimed to prevent that. We're going to stop that. In his mind, that's what he wanted, what he was saying. If every Confederate army faced pressure at the same time, none could reinforce the others. And it's kind of amazing to think that this basic common sense approach of having superior strength, resources, and numbers to fight had been employed earlier in the war. Just think what would have changed in the course of history, in the course of the war. What would have been different? Grant's strategy was simple and brutal. He himself would accompany the Army of the Potomac and pursue Robert E. Lee in Virginia. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman would drive through Georgia. Other armies would attack across the South. Everywhere the Confederates looked, Union forces would be advancing. For the first time, the Confederacy faced coordinated warfare on a continental scale. William Tecumseh Sherman, he was among Grant's closest friends during the war. He couldn't have been more different than Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was quiet. Sherman was emotional and expressive. Grant spoke little. Sherman talked constantly. Grant concealed his feelings. Sherman often displayed them openly. Earlier in the war, Sherman had actually suffered what today might be recognized as a nervous breakdown. Commanders and newspapers questioned his very sanity. He became convinced that Confederate forces vastly outnumbered his own, but Sherman recovered. He once remarked, "Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk, and now we stand by each other." Grant never lost faith in Sherman. The two men formed one of history's great military partnerships. Sherman possessed a brilliant strategic mind. He understood that wars were not won merely by defeating armies. They were won by destroying the enemy's ability and willingness to continue fighting. Unlike many soldiers of his generation, William Tecumseh Sherman viewed the war in modern terms. He believed the entire Confederate society supported the rebellion. He was right. So therefore, the entire Confederate society needed to feel the consequences. His famous declaration captured his belief: war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. Sherman didn't celebrate suffering. He simply believed it was unavoidable. The quicker the South realized resistance was hopeless, the sooner the bloodshed could end. Grant also relied heavily on General Philip Sheridan, a short, stocky guy. Sheridan lacked the imposing appearance of many more famous generals, but he possessed extraordinary aggression. If Grant's embodiment was the embodiment of determination, and Sherman was the embodiment of strategic vision, well, Sheridan embodied energy. His cavalry operations transformed mounted warfare in the East. Previously, Confederate cavalry under Jeb Stuart had often dominated the battlefield. Sheridan reversed that balance. He struck hard, he moved quickly, relentlessly pursued Confederate forces. Grant appreciated officers who acted decisively like this. And so Sheridan fit perfectly into his command structure, into Grant's command structure. So while Union strength grew, Confederate forces steadily diminished. Their resources steadily diminished. The South faced problems that battlefield heroics simply couldn't solve. Time was running out. Food shortages worsened. Railroads deteriorated. Factories struggled. Inflation spiraled out of control. Families suffered. Women waited in bread lines. Soldiers wrote heartbreaking letters home describing hunger. Desertion began to increase among Confederate ranks. The Confederacy's manpower pool shrank relentlessly. Every casualty became harder to replace. But at the same time, surrender seemed almost unimaginable. Many Southerners believed independence justified any sacrifice. Others feared what defeat would bring. Some hoped Northern voters would eventually lose the will to continue, and many placed enormous faith in Robert E. Lee. As long as Lee's army remained on the field, well, hope survived. Well, that hope would prove extraordinarily difficult to extinguish. That was the problem. The contest between Grant and Lee became one of the most famous rivalries in military history. Lee was, he's elegant, he's aristocratic, deeply admired by all of his peers and contemporaries at the time. Grant was plain, unpretentious, often underestimated. Lee inspired devotion. Grant inspired confidence. Lee excelled at operational brilliance and battlefield maneuver. Grant excelled at relentless pressure and strategic coordination. Many historians see Grant as one of the first generals of modern warfare. For years, Lee had repeatedly defeated larger Union armies. Now he faced an opponent who just refused to retreat. In May 1864, Grant crossed the Rapidan River and entered the wilderness in what became known as the Overland Campaign. Now, this fighting was savage. Dense forest caught fire. Wounded men burned alive. Thousands died in just tangled undergrowth. But after each battle, something unprecedented happened. Grant kept moving south. After the Wilderness came Spotsylvania. After Spotsylvania came Cold Harbor. After Cold Harbor came Petersburg. The casualties were horrifying through all of this. Critics called Grant a butcher. But Grant understood something that his critics didn't quite get yet. Every battle hurt both armies, and the Union could replace losses. The Confederacy increasingly couldn't do that. They didn't have that option. Lee's army bled continuously, and Grant intended to keep it that way. I propose, this is what he said, I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. He meant it, and Abraham Lincoln loved it when he heard those words. By the summer of 1864, Abraham Lincoln feared he might just lose re-election. The war seemed endless. Casualty lists filled newspapers. Northern morale, even after Gettysburg, it was just sagging, all right? And even if Lincoln privately believed defeat at the polls was possible, it's a wonder that he even allowed an election to go on. Think about that for a second. He might have enacted some type of War Powers Act and refused to allow an election until the war was over. But for Lincoln, that would have defeated the very principles of the Union he was fighting to defend. His opponent, none other than the dithering former General George McClellan, he campaigned on ending the war through negotiation. Had Lincoln lost, Confederate independence might have become a reality. That's the historical reality of what would have occurred here. McClellan would have become president. He would have been seen as a hero that brought peace and ended the war. So history would have looked completely different here. But everything changed in September. Because in September, General Sherman captured Atlanta. The victory electrified the North. For months, newspapers had wondered whether that city could be taken. Now, one of the South's most important industrial centers had fallen. Northern confidence surged, and Lincoln's prospects improved dramatically. And in November, he did win re-election. The significance of this sequence of events, it just can't be overstated. The election of 1864 became a referendum on continuing the war. The American people chose perseverance. Rather than choosing just peace and let the South do what it wants, they chose to persevere and press through, and that was what the vote for Lincoln meant at that time. The Confederacy's final hope that Northern voters would abandon the struggle, well, it collapsed at the polls in 1864. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman made what is seen by many as one of the war's most controversial decisions. He ordered military forces or military facilities destroyed in Atlanta. Large sections of the city burned, and critics accused him of barbarism. Sherman's logic was pretty straightforward. Atlanta served as a major transportation and industrial hub. If Confederate armies could no longer use its railroads, its factories and supplies, their ability to fight would diminish. And Sherman believed half measures only prolonged wars. Destroying military infrastructure would shorten the conflict in his mind. The suffering caused by continued resistance, he argued, would ultimately be worse if he didn't take steps like this. Now, whether one agrees or disagrees with his methods, Sherman represented, with this move, he represented a new understanding of warfare. Modern wars involved entire societies. It wasn't just armies meeting out on a battlefield. Whole societies were now involved. The line between military and economic and civilian power kind of became inseparable at this point. Now, we'll see this same logic in future wars, even in World War II. The Germans wouldn't quit fighting despite the obviousness of their losing the war until Hitler was dead. An even greater similarity is seen in Japan during World War II. Allies argued that the use of the atomic bombs was necessary because the Japanese and their honor culture, much like the Confederacy, would never allow them to surrender. So that same fear, that same logic was very present right here at the American Civil War as it enters its final phase, and it explains the barbarism that many in the South see in General Sherman's next moves. In November 1864, Sherman launched his most famous campaign. He left Atlanta and he marched approximately 60,000 soldiers towards Savannah, Georgia. This would become known in history as Sherman's marched to the sea. His army cut a swath through Georgia. Railroads were twisted into what soldiers called Sherman neckties. Supply depots disappeared. Confederate infrastructure simply collapsed. And that march, it carried immense psychological significance. Sherman's army operated deep inside Confederate territory with very little opposition. The campaign demonstrated that the Confederate government could no longer protect its own heartland. And so as Sherman advanced, Southern civilians increasingly confronted the reality of their own defeat. Now, many people hated Sherman, but they also feared him. They also began recognizing that the Confederacy's promises of victory, these were just illusions now. When Sherman captured Savannah in December 1864, he telegraphed Lincoln that he offered the city as a Christmas gift. The Confederacy was now being squeezed from every direction. By early 1865, the coming months after the fall of Savannah, Confederate collapse accelerated. Sherman moved north through the Carolinas. Grant tightened his grip around Petersburg and Richmond. Food shortages became catastrophic. Government authority in the South weakened. In some places, it collapsed altogether. Exhausted soldiers deserted. But Lee, Robert E. Lee, General Lee, continued fighting. Many Confederates still held out, still hoped for a miracle, but there was no miracle coming. General Grant had concluded by the summer of 1864 that defeating Lee would require relentless pressure. So after weeks of bloody fighting in Virginia's wilderness, at Spotsylvania and at Cold Harbor, Grant shifted his army south toward Petersburg. That was a vital railroad hub supplying the Confederate capital of Richmond. If Petersburg fell, Richmond would become impossible to defend. And Lee understood this. He rushed his exhausted army into the trenches around the city. And what followed was one of the first modern siege campaigns in American history. Soldiers on both sides dug miles of earthworks, forts, trenches, stretching across the countryside. The lines foreshadowed the trench warfare that would dominate Europe nearly half a century later during World War I. And life in these trenches was miserable. Soldiers endured mud and heat, disease, sharpshooters, constant artillery fire. One dramatic episode occurred in July 1864 when Union troops detonated a massive mine beneath Confederate lines in an event known as the Crater. The explosion created chaos, but poor leadership just squandered the opportunity, and Confederate defenders inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Union forces. Like the bomb went off, this crater's made, the Union forces dive in, and they just get stuck inside the crater. Confederate forces fire down. It's just a massacre. As the months dragged on, Grant's strategy of attrition began to work. The Union possessed more men, more supplies, and greater industrial strength. Every railroad capture tightened that noose around Lee's army. And by early 1865, Confederate soldiers were starving. Like I said, desertions were increasing. Supplies were dwindling to almost nothing. April 2nd, 1865, Grant finally breaks through Petersburg defenses. Lee evacuated both Petersburg and Richmond, beginning the desperate retreat that would bring about the end of his own army. Petersburg was the final death struggle of the Confederacy. It's where Lee's army slowly bled away until ultimately surrender became just unavoidable. Richmond, Virginia was the Confederate capital, and it became, at this point, indefensible. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government fled. As Lee gave up on Petersburg, he sent messengers to warn Davis of what's coming in Richmond. Those messengers arrived while Jefferson Davis was in church, and onlookers who were in the church with him said they saw him read the message, and he just turned pale as a ghost. He exited the church quickly, fled the city. The city they had governed for 4 years was now abandoned. And as Union troops entered Richmond, fires consumed portions of the city. And finally, right here, this is where the Confederacy's heart had stopped beating. Lee retreated westward, hoping to join other Confederate forces. Grant pursued him relentlessly. Union soldiers marched through rain, through mud, exhaustion, hunger, and although his supply lines were being broken by this chase because of how fast he's moving, Ulysses S. Grant, he just wouldn't let up. Everyone sensed the end was approaching. He's hungry for it, like he wants it. Finally, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee recognized further resistance was just hopeless. Near the village of Appomattox Courthouse, he requested a meeting. The surrender actually occurred in the home of Wilmer McLean, and by coincidence, The first battle of the war, the Battle of Bull Run, had taken place on McLean's farm, his pasture. Now it would close in his living room, or at least the bulk of it would close in his living room. The contrast between the two generals really became legendary here. Lee arrived for this ceremony, this agreement, this surrender, this discussion of terms for surrender. He arrived impeccably dressed in a magnificent uniform, the picture of the South's aristocracy. Grant, he arrived mud-stained. He's wearing a simple field uniform. His dress uniform was actually 3 days behind him because his pursuit of Robert E. Lee had been so dogged. The meeting was respectful. Grant understood the significance of the moment. Humiliation could poison reconciliation. Generosity might encourage peace. And so the surrender terms reflected that philosophy. Grant and Lincoln had already shared this philosophy in preparation for the day as it approached. Confederate officers, they could even keep their sidearms. Soldiers could keep their horses for spring planting. Paroled troops could return home. Grant even ordered Union soldiers not to celebrate too excessively. The war is over, he said in effect. The rebels are our countrymen again. Lee accepted the terms, and one of history's greatest civil wars was finally ending. In his second inaugural address, delivered just a few weeks earlier before this surrender, Lincoln spoke not of vengeance, but of healing in the nation. He saw the end of the war on the horizon, and it was this vision that Grant embraced at Appomattox. With malice towards none, with charity towards all. Those words from Lincoln's second inaugural address, it really captured that vision. The president understood that military victory alone couldn't restore the nation. He intended Reconstruction to be a generous effort, a generous project. He hoped former Confederates would quickly rejoin national life. The future remained uncertain, but Lincoln believed mercy offered the best path forward. Lee's surrender didn't immediately end the war. Other Confederate armies remained in the field, but Appomattox shattered resistance. Within weeks, Confederate forces across the South surrendered one after another. General Joseph E. Johnson surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina. Other commanders followed. The remaining Confederate governments dissolved. One by one, the banners came down. The Confederacy, it ceased to exist. 4 years of war had cost approximately 750,000 lives, maybe more. No American conflict, before or since, has ever approached the scale of destruction that had been unleashed in those 4 years. The Confederate President Jefferson Davis, he fled south after Richmond's fall. For weeks he remained a fugitive. Rumors spread wildly. Some believed he might continue the war. Others thought he would escape abroad. Lincoln had actually told Grant before the surrenders came, before it actually occurred, that if Davis and the other key leaders of the Confederacy fled to other nations, he wouldn't mind it too much, and he probably wouldn't work too hard to bring them back to the U.S. Jefferson Davis, he was actually trying to get to Texas, where he hoped to revive the hopes of the Confederacy. It wasn't going to happen, though. Union cavalry eventually captured him in Georgia on May 10, 1865. That moment carried enormous symbolic weight. The President of the Confederacy, the political embodiment of secession, he's now a prisoner. And so here, the rebellion had truly ended. No government remained. Davis would be held prisoner until the spring of 1867. He was released on bond, and much of the South would blame him in the future for the failure of the Confederacy. It wasn't his fault, though. The Confederacy was always doomed to failure. But that narrative was the one that many Americans in the South preferred. It would come to make up a key component of the lost cause, which we'll look at in a later episode. In the popular imagination of the South, they lost because of the politicians. It was the honor of the generals like Robert E. Lee that kept them going for so long. But the Confederate experiment, one way or the other, it was over now. And then came the tragedy that no one could have expected at the time. April 14th, 1865, only 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln attended a performance, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater. The atmosphere in Washington, it's celebratory. The war was ending. The Capitol was rejoicing. Lincoln himself, he seemed lighter than he had in years. And friends noticed it. The burden he had carried since 1861, it appeared finally to be lifting. Now, among those in the audience was actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Booth believed the South had been destroyed. He despised Lincoln for defeating the Confederacy, and particularly for freeing the slaves. Shortly after 10 p.m., Strengthening his courage with several gulps of brandy, John Wilkes Booth entered Lincoln's box and fired a single shot into the back of the president's head. John Wilkes Booth leapt off the stage and escaped into the night. Lincoln never regained consciousness, probably never knew what hit him. The wounded president was carried across the street to a boarding house. Throughout the night, family members, cabinet officials, military officials, officers, friends, they gathered around him. 7:22 a.m., April 15th, 1865, the president, Abraham Lincoln, was pronounced dead. Secretary of War Edward M. Stanton reportedly looked upon the fallen president and he declared, "Now he belongs to the ages." Now, you never want someone like Lincoln to be killed, obviously. But as we get into the next part of the story of the empire, a 250-year American story, it strikes me that this assassination preserved Lincoln's legacy and his ideals, and those would become incredibly powerful and influential for future generations. More than likely, this is just, you can't know this for sure, but more than likely his reputation would have suffered in the post-war years had he not been assassinated. The war might even have resumed. Whatever would have come next, and how Lincoln would have responded compared to his successors, obviously we can never know. But for now, this is where this part of the story ends, with one final tragedy thrown atop years of the tragedy of the American Civil War. More than 750,000 Americans were killed. By 1865, at the end of the war, more than 1 million Americans on both sides were wounded, captured, or missing. In the South, 1 in 4 Southern white men of military age had died. Few societies in modern history have suffered such a devastating loss of an entire generation of young men. The South also lay in ruins from just from an economic standpoint. Confederate wealth, that wealth of the aristocracy, it had collapsed by an estimated 60%. More Americans died in the Civil War than in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam combined. That's the terrible, the dreadful story of the American Civil War. Now we're going to see what comes next. We're going to look at Reconstruction. We're going to look at the lost cause in the episodes that are still to come. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History and the End of History podcast, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made these times.